Hey there, Heather with Snap Happy Gal Photography here. When I recently asked you guys what topics you wanted me to cover, many of you responded that you wanted to learn how to edit sunsets. But before we jump into editing images with a high dynamic range, we first need to become masters of the histogram, which is just a visual representation of the light and dark tones in your images. So let's do a deep dive on that, and then we'll come back to do those sunsets.
In Lightroom, in the Develop module, your histogram lives in the upper right-hand corner. I have mine expanded, and I recommend you do the same by clicking and dragging this line, but not so much that it makes your image small. You definitely want the image as large as possible. Before we start looking at histograms, make sure that this soft proofing box is checked so that you can then select the sRGB profile. The reason for this is because then the data that's displayed here will match what printers can print. You can't match everyone's screens, and you want to make sure that what you see up here represents something you might get for actual output in the real world. I've selected images with a variety of lighting and exposures so that we can learn what the histograms are showing us. So the histogram is laid out with the dark tones on the left and the light tones on the right, with the darkest tones being called blacks, and then shadows, and then the midtones Lightroom just kind of labels as exposure. And then you have highlights, and at the brightest end of the spectrum are whites. These are also corresponding to the sliders that you can adjust down here, which we will do in a later video. So as you can see, this image does have some data at the very far end of the dark spectrum, but most of the data lives in the highlights and the whites region. A similarly lit image here. Lots of light tones represented by this big spike on the right end of the spectrum, and then some medium dark tones represented here in the trees, and you will notice that the data does not reach over into the full black end of the spectrum. Another very bright image, although we have some data reaching all the way down into the blacks, lots of shadows and midtones, and then a huge spike in the whites where it's overexposed. A tough one to edit. Lots of light and dark. You'll notice there's not a lot in the midtones. Loads and loads of dark data, and then a spike in the whites. And then just for fun, because we will come back to this later, not quite so much in the blacks, still loads of dark tones, some here in the middle, and then a big spike in the whites, but not quite as much all the way on the very tippy top end of that range. Ooh, now looking at a dark image. So this is a moon. You can see that's represented probably right here. And then all the rest of the tones in the image are dark. So we have some midtones and then lots and lots of darks, and just barely touching the end here on the blacks. Whereas this image, an underexposed version of the previous one, has barely any touching on the white end, some midtones, and then mostly shadows and black tones. Here are the sunsets you guys asked about. These are challenging because there's lots and lots of dark data, some midtones, and then not much until a spike right where the sun is in the whites. A very similar scene shot on a different camera for the purposes of editing later with you guys. So again, lots of dark tones represented down here on this left end of the histogram, not so much in the midtones, and then a little spike probably representing the sun. And we'll look at how you can tell where this data is in the future. A fun view from the Manistee River Trail. As you can see, this is mostly darks, lots and lots of midtones here, and none of the clouds are reaching into the white end of the spectrum. And here we'll look at some images that kind of highlight what a histogram looks like when you've got lots of midtones. So some data down at the very dark end of the spectrum and some data at the very brightest end of the spectrum, but most of the data in the image is in the midtones, so that makes this one an easy one to edit. Similar here of my dog. Some data at the darkest end of the spectrum, probably around his eyes, maybe some of the trees in the background up here. And then some highlight, probably that scarf he's wearing, because bright colors tend to clip, and we'll talk about what that means later also. But mostly the data in this image lives right in the middle. Okay, another completely mid-tone image. This one, as you can see, borders on dark just because the data lives in the left half of the spectrum, but there's almost no data either at the far dark end or the far highlight end. It's all midtones, a low contrast image.
Hopefully now you have a pretty good idea of how the tones in your image map out onto a histogram. Join me next time and we will put this information to use processing some images.